Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the 18th century Africa workshops. We had a really good first day yesterday, so I hope we're able to keep the conversation going today. So today we will be starting with a 5-person series. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my my program. Looking at what is this stuff now? Looking at consumption and the slave trade.
Okay, so again, I apologize if somebody comes in. I'm on campus. What I wanted to go through today, and it's a paper I've been working on for a little while, trying to figure out how to contextualize everything. But looking at how the trading landscape of the Gambia River shifted from the earliest arrival of European traders starting in the 15th century all the way through to British abolition in the 19th century and the different goods that were passing in and out. So ultimately looking at how material items were transferred to purchase people to enslave them. So how we took things and turned people into slaves through that exchange. So I just have a few maps that I wanted to show so you all had an idea of where I was talking about and what this landscape was that I'm referring to. So here you should all see a map of just a locator map for the Gambia, and then the main ports and sites that I'll be talking about are here in the center. And one specifically, I'm focusing on the coastal polity of Numi, but there are also a few others that were influential at different points in the trade. And you can see where the British trading companies and later the French shifted their effort as different polities came in and out of power through their own conflicts in the region. So Combo was pretty influential early on, and you could see these two polities control the entrance of the river. So just geographically located in a good spot. And then when the Portuguese first arrived in the 15th century, it was Surico and Cantor that were the main trading depots, and these quickly fell out of power by the start of the 17th century as more and more caravans began to go directly to the coast where the British and later French set up their main outposts. So the main sites that I look at and where I've conducted archaeological excavations and some of the material goods that I'll refer to are coming from are Giuffre, Albreda, Giuffre, Albreda. These were already established towns before the French and the British set up shop there in the 17th century. Laming is an outer village that existed, but kind of grew up a little bit being peripheral to these two main trading sites. James Island, I'll get into in a little bit, becomes pretty central here in the 18th century. And then San Domingo was a Luso-African settlement early on, and then shifted to become a depot where the British trading companies kept castle slaves throughout the 18th century. And then you could see on the south bank of the river, Breffett, which the British had a trading depot at very briefly in the 17th and early 18th century, but it stayed a somewhat important trading town into the late 18th century because it was easy to kind of sneak away there and hide a little bit. So James Fort, which is shown here, is initially St. Andrew's Island, named by the Portuguese as they passed. A small contingent of Courlanders established a little base there, but by the mid 17th century, the British effectively have taken control of the island. By the late 17th century, they've really built it up. You could see here the central fort remains the same, and they set up a series of warehouses, living spaces. There's some spaces for castle slaves here as well. So these are slaves owned by, that's this building here, owned by the company directly. And most of the castle slaves that were kept on the Gambia River were brought in from the Gold Coast. So they built it up and they make this their main base of operation. From here, they have a secondary depot at Jufre. So here you could see the remains of the trading house there, and then just a reconstruction of the village. But Jufre becomes very important because this is where the Royal African Company and then later successive companies attempt to keep a lot of the enslaved that they purchase from the different caravans coming in and out while they're preparing to send them across the Atlantic. The space on James Island is never very large. It cannot accommodate a lot of people. And so they had these secondary areas where people will be held as they were purchased. And it was also in these trading houses where they kept this wide array of goods that they would use to enslave people and purchase other goods off of the caravans coming in and out. And throughout the Royal African Company and later successive company records, you see that by the time a ship comes in from Europe with some of these goods, they're already out of fashion. And so it was very difficult to predict some of the supply and demand needs as shipping became irregular throughout different phases of the 18th century. So what I just wanted to show you all very briefly, and I apologize, this looks much better when it's projected on a big screen. I realize you can't see a lot of these, and so I've tried to enlarge it as I go. What the different trading companies did was set up a series of regular sloops that went out to known ports, and and that's what's marked here. So these are the different ports that the initial trading company, the Royal Adventurers, would go out to. Then they would send up trading houses. These are the British ones marked at these different villages that were already along known caravan routes. And then they send out one or two unique voyages to different ports if they heard that a caravan had come in there, and that's this green star. So you can see it's pretty spread out in the 17th century. They're trying to figure out what's going on. By the end of the 17th century, when you get the Royal African Company taking over, you still have the same series of ports that they're regularly visiting. They have a few less trading depots, but they've also shifted where along the river they're focusing their efforts. And then they still maintain some of these unique voyages if a large number of caravans have come in, bringing enslaved individuals as well as other goods such as ivory and beeswax at this time. But it's really once you get into the first half of the 18th century that the British have really taken hold, and they've really got a system underway for how to do this. So a few of the ports have shifted as the caravans have shifted where they're going, because they're also now trying to go directly to some of these outposts. And you could see the Royal African Company has them set up in a larger number throughout most of the river. And so it's become easier to access the caravans in some ways, but it's also harder to keep these outposts stocked with the goods that are in demand. And then you see a number of individual voyages happen as caravans come in unannounced to these different ports, and people get word. And then you have the French, who just settle right here at the mouth of the river, competing with the British. And so you could see, and I don't expect you all to read these, but it's really in this first half of the 18th century that the slave trade is dominant on the Gambia River. It's never as big as it is in other areas of the coast. But what you have is the British and the French, as well as other European countries that just are sending ships in, really competing against one another. And you see not only prices, but the array of goods that are needed just to purchase a few slaves here and there off the caravan shift a lot. And so what this quote is talking about it in the local standard, which was iron bars at the time, and just how that is constantly going up. And if you didn't have iron on hand, you had to come up with a bundle of different goods that would hit this iron equivalent. And throughout the Royal African Company records, you see this as a mix of various types of beads, up to 10 or 12 varieties, brandy, rum, various types of cloth, guns, brass pans, various coins, trading guns, and all of these measured out either in quantities or weights. And so fixing that exact amount. So you could have 20 different goods in various weights and quantities to purchase 1 or 2 slaves. And this shifts throughout this period. By the time the Committee of Merchants takes over, in the latter half of the 18th century, they're really concentrated on the coast, and you see the shift in goods occur with this. The Committee of Merchants is bringing fewer types of goods. These bundles that they're exchanging to purchase and slave include less things, and they are also less reliant on the use of castle slaves for labor, whereas the Royal African Company had the depot at San Domingo, and they also had some at Jamesport. They had a few at different companies, and they would also pay the castle slaves in goods, and the castle slaves at times would even purchase their own here. I found 1 or 2 records. So it gets kind of complicated as to what's going on and the goods that are coming in. And a lot of this is dependent on how the landscape is growing and shrinking. By the 19th century, with abolition taking hold with the British, you really see a drop off in all goods as the caravans stop coming, which impacts the local communities and depletes their access to wealth through the Atlantic trade at this time. So this is still some things I'm working through to try to think of how not only the shift in the slave trade impacted how people's daily lives on the river were affected by where trading occurred, but also the types of goods that they had access to, and those goods that were really just reserved to, in fact, enslave people throughout the river. So thank you. I realize I went a little over. I apologize.
Thanks very much. Next up, we have Philip Emanuel.
Good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Thank you to the organizers for putting this together. Thank you all for coming. I wanted to start as well with a warning. I'm going to be talking about child enslavement, violence, including sexual violence against children. So I wanted to foreshadow that before I begin. And I hope you can see the screen share. This paper is from a chapter of my dissertation, which deals with enslaved children around the Atlantic world and their experience of different forms of slavery in West Africa, in the Caribbean, in North America, and in Europe as well. And particularly, I'm working on a sort of cultural history of empire and slavery and the way in which their presence in the metropole becomes a way of demonstrating and performing, demonstrating and performing control over non-white bodies, because boys in particular are more subject and easily dominated, but nonetheless masculine. And so this is the sort of image that many people are familiar with when discussing enslaved Africans in Europe. This is often where the discussion is. There's a considerable amount of art historical literature and other work on the presence of page boys, enslaved boys in portraiture, like this famous picture of Elihu Yale, which is at the Yale Center for British Art. There's less work on the origins of those boys, where they come from and how they get to be in Europe. But in my research, I found quite a lot of reference in the papers of the Royal Africa Company at Kew to gifts of boys to people in Britain. And so it's very different to this traditional framework of what the plantations want in terms of age and working capability. Here you have one of many references from the company who are explicitly asking that they want people over 12 and under 30 who are the ideal for the work in the plantations that is being done. And but the people who you see in portraits in Britain, like the one in the portrait with Yale, are often younger than that, and that the references are sometimes specific in assigning young ages to them. I've gathered a few here, and these are explicitly children. As you see here, 5 children, a black boy, and multiple boys sent on the right-hand side, sent by Sir Dalby Thomas, who had just arrived in 1703 to Cape Coast Castle as the Governor General for the company. Unlike the reference to wanting people between about 12 and 30 to go to the Americas, these are much more explicitly childhood. And there are quite a few of these. Some of these go out to the Caribbean, to factors in the Caribbean. Some of them go direct to the African coast. And that it's pretty clear that this is the source of most of, or many of these children who are brought to England and to other parts of Europe, and who appear in these portraits, not as laborers in the way that they're wanted in the American colonies, not at least as extractive laborers, but that they have other roles. They are demonstrating a certain element of exotic influence on the metropole. And so I was curious about what this might mean. Clearly the exoticism is important. And if you look at some of these portraits, here's another example, quite well-known one, of Mary Stuart, the daughter of Charles I, with an enslaved African, but also with Indian calico, silks, a turban, ostrich feathers, pearls, and an indigenous American feather cloak. And so the exoticism is a part of this. This is one of the roles they're playing. It's not extractive labor, it's labor as display. But given that a lot of these boys come from the African coast and they play a very imperial role once they're sort of taken away from that space, I started to look into whether there's an African influence on this form of Atlantic slavery, and particularly in this earlier period when European power on the coast is operating very much more within African models. And one of the most important ways that I've seen this is that on the African coast, the Europeans rely very heavily on boys as intermediaries between the forts and with local elites. And so when they send messages to one another within the the Royal African Company network, they often send it by my boy. When they send messages to rival imperial or trading powers, so to the Dutch or the Danes or the Germans, they often send or receive messages by a boy. And when they're dealing with the Africans who they're trading with, or with whom they have a political relationship, or by whose permission they hold their fort, the intermediaries are often boys. And here, again, the labor is not an extractive, productive labor, but linguistic and intermediary and intercultural. And that I believe, and I would argue that the English and others are adopting an African practice here. Here I have a few more, and I apologize for the enormous amount of quotation, but I thought I would at least give you the chance to follow along. At the top, you have reference to Captain Dakey, whose Dick's Cove in Ghana is named after him, Dakey's Cove, who sent boys to establish contact with the RAC official. There's a quotation there from Willem Bosman, who others have mentioned already, talking about how African elites were attended not by a huge train of followers, by a pair of boys, one carrying a sword and another carrying a stool, in other words, the symbols of their power. And then at the bottom, I've got 2 letters from Francis Frankland, who's another RAC agent, who has started to send gifts of boys to his superiors at Cape Coast Castle, and in fact makes a reference to getting more from Ansa Sasraku, who is inland in Akwamu. And this particular model, I think, is relying on childhood as a form of subordination within both cultures. Children are subordinate to older men in European contexts and in African contexts. They have a symbolic value as representing wealth in people within the African context, and they are their age and their gender makes them subordinate within those societies, but subordinate for a very specific period, because of course boys grow into men and at that point become less of a controllable group, by default at least, than boys would otherwise be. And in fact, in many cases, I've found examples of them then being put into the Atlantic trade, being sent to the Americas once they move into that age group where their labor value is greater and where their potential challenge to the authority of those who are enslaving them is greater. And an example of this will finish me off, I think, here. These are all boys who were sent to John Perry, who was the company secretary in London. And I've got three sort of collections here. The two on the left are from 1705 and clearly refer to the same individual. The two on the right are a few years later and again refer to a single individual from 1710. And then at the bottom, there's another individual from 1712. And Perry is being very specific about ages. And I argue that the reason why he's constantly getting another person is that they reach a point where he no longer wants them in his household. And I think there's a potential here for sexual violence against these young people, because he is being specific in asking for pubescent males. That's a suspicion I have and can be no more, but the domination of those boys within his household is something that's possible because of their age, because they're subordinate within an English model, and because they represent the sort of wealth in people and power within the African model. My argument in the larger chapter is that the British adopt this as a way of demonstrating power over the slave trade, over non-white people, and that enslaved boys stand in for all non-white people and become part of a performance of automatic and default authority, and that their age and their gender are critical to that. And so this is a subject that's been studied more in the modern period, childhood and age and what that means in these cultural contexts. But with the theme of our conference being pre-1800, the 18th century, and certainly some of my work in the 17th, I wanted to raise the prospect that actually this has important meanings that are cross-cultural in this period, in the time when there is more exchange and before the question of sort of mixed race people in the later period becomes part of the historiography, and an important part of the historiography. And so I think I'm probably running very close up against my time, and we'll leave it there. But I thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then our final paper for this panel is from Abigail Moffett.
Super. Yeah, thanks everybody for the talk so far, and thank you very much for the conference and to everyone who's organized it. I am presenting on behalf of two of my co-authors, Anne Hauer and John Mack, and we're all from the Sainsbury Research Unit. And our focus for this conference has been looking at cowrie shells within sort of as a conduit, as a material conduit for thinking about circulation and valuation and exchange networks in the 18th century in Africa. And as two of us are archaeologists, our approach is very much a longue durée approach, looking both at cowrie shells through time, but also at the 18th century in contrast to the other time periods in East Africa. And we've tried to focus more on southern parts, so on Tanzania and Mozambique, and also looking at the relationship between the East African coastline and Madagascar. Just a brief overview. These are cowrie shells on the top right of the screen. There are two main species of shell, or there are lots of different species of cowrie shells, but the two main ones that are used or were used very widely historically and archaeologically are Monetaria annulus, which is the one on the left, and Monetaria monita, which is the one on the right. And these occur naturally across the Indian Ocean, but they occur in different geographic regions in certain densities. And they were used by communities across the world for some antiquity, from the Neolithic period in many parts of Europe and the Middle East. And one species, monita, has got a lot of attention, particularly because of its association with the slave trade. It was exported in large quantities to West Africa in the 18th and 19th century, where it sort of became a form of currency. But this has a longer historical precedence, and we know from historical documents and from the work of one of our colleagues, Anne Hauer, that monita cowries were harvested in exchange from the Maldive Islands from the late first millennium, and they made their way across to West Africa via trans-Saharan trade networks. In contrast, we know actually very little about the other species of cowrie, particularly within African archaeological and historical context. And this is the species that's dominant in East Africa, so it would have been locally available for people to collect and to utilize. What we do know is that in the 19th century, these annulus cowries became very closely associated with the caravan trade routes and the ivory and later slave trade in East Africa. And so historians such as Karin Palava and others have noted the close association between annulus cowries and currency in East Africa in the 19th century. And this is the period where we know that, we know from historical records that cowries begin to be exported in large quantities from East Africa via trans-Saharan, via mercantile trade networks by European merchants, and they actually brought into West Africa. And by the mid-19th century, they undermined the local cowrie currencies. Their huge sort of importation causes a massive inflation in the value of cowries, and sort of collapses the cowrie currency in West Africa. But as part of our research, we've been looking at cowries in East Africa through time, and although very poorly documented in archaeological records, they do occur actually from the late first millennium AD in many coastal sites in East Africa, as well as in interior sites. So this is an example of two hordes of cowries that were found from the quite iconic site of Shanga, which is a Swahili site from the early to mid 2nd millennium AD. So this gives us an idea that cowries were actually part of some form of exchange and consumption in East Africa over a much, much longer time period. And our research into the 18th century has been guided somewhat by the work of the historian Thomas Vernet, who highlighted the significance of cowries in potentially in global networks in the 18th century. So Thomas brought attention to the account by a French slave trader, Jean-Vincent Maurice, who visited the East African coastline in the 1770s. And he documented that cowries were actually being exported in quite large numbers from islands of Zanzibar and islands off the coast of Tanzania. And he mentioned that these were transported by English and French ships that were taking them not actually to West Africa, but to the Indian subcontinent, where they were used in exchange in Bengal and other places. He also, so he testifies to a commission and mentions that this is actually quite a significant, quite significant volumes of Annulus cowries are going to the Indian subcontinent. There's also other accounts of traders that travel from East Africa to the Indian subcontinent to gain markets for cowries and to gain sellers. So there's two historical or a number of historical suggestions that indicate that in the 18th century there are various actors in East Africa that are sort of mobilizing around the potential of cowries within Indian Ocean trade networks, particularly with regards to export to the Indian subcontinent. And to kind of to bring it back to the archaeology, it's a difficult time period to identify archaeologically because radiocarbon dates do not necessarily work in the 18th century or particularly later parts of the 18th century, and it's not been a very well studied time period in East Africa. However, there is a number of ongoing research projects that suggest that provide some tantalizing evidence that cowries were actually being traded through inland trade routes in the 18th century too. So this is recent research by Thomas Biganagwa, and he's looking at caravan trade routes that link the coast to the interior in the prior to the 19th century, and he's documented how actually what we associate with 19th century caravan trade routes have a much longer historical precedence in the region, and one of the items that he finds throughout all of the excavation layers are cowrie shells. Of course, more research into these cowrie shells will kind of be able to pick apart if we can see trends and similarities. For example, the earlier picture I showed of cowrie currencies might be quite different to how cowries would have been used in the 18th century. And that's something that we're working on. Yeah, but to conclude, there is tantalizing evidence to suggest that in the 18th century, that it was not in the 19th century, but actually in the 18th century, where you begin to see the mobilization of African communities in East Africa around the export of cowries in response to global demand, although it's always been overshadowed, particularly in terms of the role of bonita cowries in the slave trade. It seems that Annulus cowries also had a market, particularly in the Indian subcontinent. And there's some suggestion that, particularly along the Mozambican coastline, where there's a huge amount of, there's a large number of connections and cultural transfer between Mozambique and India in the 18th century, that there were communities moving to and from these different places, and that innovations such as, or not innovations, but changes in production and consumption patterns, such as the export of cowries, may have been linked to sort of new networks. So yeah, that is where I will stop for now.
Thanks very much. If the panelists would like to turn on their screen, or turn on their cameras, that would be great. And then, so yeah, just to start, do any of you have any questions or points of discussion that you would like to raise with each other on your quite related papers? One of the things that really struck me when I was reading all of your abstracts, and one of the reasons they all ended up on the same sort of panel, was in thinking about this question of changing trends in how people are engaging with slavery, and how consumption and slavery are linked over the course of the 18th century. And to that point, I was wondering, and it sort of came up in most of your presentations, but in particular, I think there's an aspect of the two Phillips papers that I was wondering if it could be explored a little bit more, but everybody else is welcome to join in as well. Thinking about the role of sort of fashion, display, trendiness, changing consumption patterns, and how that is affecting the sort of decisions that people are making about the slave trade.
I'll jump in. Thank you for the question. Yeah, the sort of the depiction of enslaved children in portraits is a long discussed and very big thing, and it starts earlier in some places than in others. It happens earlier in Italy than it does in Britain and France and the Netherlands. But it seems to coincide with sort of this serious investment in the slave trade in Britain. And a lot of the people who do display, and I've done other work in other archives and in sources like the London Gazette, which has a lot of runaway ads, that shows that a lot of the people who are enslaving Africans in Europe are merchants or people connected with the African trade, or sailors, or there are courtiers as well. It's a popular thing at court, but it's clearly coming with this association with Atlantic trade, so I think it lasts for a long time, and it lasts at these different levels for a long time. There are some famous examples from much later in the 18th century of aristocrats and merchants who do the same thing. But it's clearly a consumption pattern that I think follows investment in consuming bodies, and that the Royal Africa Company was interesting to study precisely because these are the people who are using it to demonstrate their investment in that consumption of bodies.
Do you think that it's driven by those same considerations? It's because you're saying that they're picking up on a West African pattern in your paper. So is it a trend is it time limited? Is it something that they've seen in West Africa, decided as an African thing, and then do as a sort of way of displaying this exotic thing without any reference to necessarily the sort of timeness of it being a potentially particular fashion at a given moment in West Africa? I think now there's suddenly lots of hands, so feel free to come back or hand it to somebody else. It's up to you.
Yes, I'll quickly say, yeah, I think there is a period of influence from West Africa where the sort of the English turn up and they get given boys on arrival, and they start to adopt this practice pretty quickly. Sir Dorby Thomas arrives in Africa in 1703, and he's sending boys back almost immediately. But I'll hand it off to somebody else to have their say rather than going on and on. But thank you for the question.
Feel free to jump in. I don't remember who was first. Andrea.
Can I? Sorry, it's just that it follows so nicely from Philip's point. I'm fascinated by this because, like Liza and others here, I'm a West Africanist originally, and carriers are intimately associated with the Atlantic trade in enslaved people. Although carriers came into West Africa much earlier than then, but anyway. Whereas in East Africa, you don't get that association. So as Philip was speaking, I was wondering whether I've always wondered whether the Europeans kind of got that message from West Africa and then kind of adopted it in East Africa, and the association of cowrie shells with enslaved people doesn't occur in East Africa for that reason. Anyway, this is a bit of an unformed question, but I do think it's very interesting to think about. I've never really dealt with the European presence in Africa, and now I'm beginning to look at it. I just realized how they were linking in the different aspects of their worldwide experience. Going like, this currency or this commodity is valuable in India. Let's take it from here and move it there. So I think that the points being made are really interesting in other domains.
Liza, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say it's not exactly the same with the boys, but you see, at least in the Senegambia records, to different items, most of the items that are being exchanged end up becoming forms of display that we wouldn't think of. So keys and bells are a big form of adornment that are throughout the records, and they talk of different traders who dress their wives with these, or different merchants who are, or others that are trying to serve as linguisters. So those intermediaries, similar to the boys that Philip was talking about, would wear certain clothing and wear items to signal their access to trade and how they're involved in it. So it's not quite the same, but you do see a lot of it is this public outward display showing your status and connection to the trade. And most of these things then drop off as major trade items as the slave trade wanes in the region. So display in some way and connected to that, and how some of these enslaved boys would be dressed in finery just to show that you can and the wealth that you have, and then they're representative of you in this way. And many people would do that with their wives as well.
Thank you very much, everybody. And hopefully, again, some of this conversation will keep going with the next group.
All right. I'll just share my screen. Okay. All right, I'm just going to echo the thanks. This is just really wonderful opportunity, and I'm really grateful to Bronwen for bringing us all together. I'm writing a book about African Atlantic musical life in the era of slavery, particularly between 1600 and 1800, or roughly the rise of plantation slavery. And during my research, I came to realize that if I wanted to understand what was going on in the Caribbean and in American slave societies, I really needed to understand what was going on the other side of the ocean. This led me to reading travel narratives and other ethnographic accounts documenting life on the slave trading coasts of Africa. Most of these kinds of records, as many of you are probably aware, include portrayals of music. And in fact, it became formulaic within the genre of travel memoir to describe musical performances. Of course, European travelers often did not like or understand the performances that they witnessed. So in my work, I must wade through these interpretations and draw from methods and sound studies to uncover details about the musical lives of Africans. I began to notice one interesting trend in authors' descriptions of musical instrument design. And what I started to notice was that there were many descriptions of small jangling objects that are attached to different kinds of instruments. And these decorative musical devices were put to many different purposes in distinct genres and traditions. But I was surprised to find examples of this instrument design and sound technology from pretty expansive geographies, including parts of Senegambia, the Gold Coast, and the West Central African kingdoms. I'm hesitant to draw connections across such vast cultural terrain, especially given the tendencies of Westerners to universalize African cultures and homogenize African history. But at the same time, from the perspective of a scholar studying the experiences of Africans living under slavery, shared contexts across diverse African tradition becomes really interesting. So this is a tricky problem, and one that we might talk more about in Q&A if anyone else is interested. So for some examples, forgive me, I'm going to start in the 17th century, but we'll get to the 18th. In 1620s Gambia River region, Richard Jobson described a bala player who wore metal bracelets on his wrists. The bracelets were made out of great rings of iron, and attached to the larger rings were smaller rings and juggling toys. And as the Gambian musician worked his hands across the keys while playing, his movements would cause his bracelets to shake, creating rich aural textures that complemented the instrument's unique buzzing sound. Balas, often called ballophones in the West, have gourd resonators that hang beneath the keys. These resonators, which are also used in other kinds of instrument designs, also serve to amplify and modify the sounds of the keyed instrument. The bracelets created a sound of their own, but they also drew visual attention to the physical act of performing. So this is all to say that the instrument design and the bracelets that the musician wore all worked together to create, to achieve a musical ideal that was at once seen, felt, and heard. And this is not from Jobson, it's from a later narrative of Gambia. In the late 18th century, along the Sierra Leone River, English traveler John Matthews described enormous drums that were ornamented on the drum head with shark's teeth or bits of copper, which make a jingling noise when the drum is played. And in the 1732 narrative, Frenchman Jean Barbeau described a stringed instrument in West Africa that had little plates of iron and small bells attached to the strings. More than a century earlier, in the 1590s, narrative Duarte Lopez described court instruments in the Kingdom of Congo that also had thin metal rings attached to the strings. All of these musical implements embellished the sounds that the instruments make and highlight the process of creating musical sound through body movement and vibration. Some theorists of sound argue that all sound, and therefore also all music, is essentially vibration. Vocal sounds are created by the vibration of vocal cords. String music is created by the vibration of strings, and listeners perceive sound through the vibration of eardrums, and to a lesser extent through the vibrating sensations of other body mass. And if you've ever stood too close to a speaker at a loud concert, or if you've played a really large drum, then you know what it means to feel sound through bodily vibration. The shaking bracelets and jingling bits of copper and shells and other materials, they decorate this vibrational aspect of music making, amplifying it and make it more visible and perceptible and pleasurable. Now, largely speaking, European travelers disliked these sounds and the devices that made them. They were not culturally conditioned to understand or appreciate them based on the kind of musical aesthetics that their ears had been trained with. They sometimes described these sounds using words like rough, noisy, mingled, confused, even barbarous in Jobson's words. On the other hand, many European travelers appreciated other kinds of musical attributes and practices that they encountered on African coasts. And in the larger project, I discussed the fact that Europeans tended to write favorably about military music and instruments like horns and drums. They also wrote positively about court performances that were connected to the praise of leaders and sovereigns. These traditions were more familiar to them, and they were connected to status and wealth, things that Europeans were bent on gaining through their African travel and trade. And John Thornton has written about systems of musical patronage and how similar some of them were in early modern African courts, had a lot of similarities to European court music practices. And also there's an Afro-British composer, Tunde Jigede, who's a kora player and cellist and a composer who's done really interesting work on griot music as court music and thinking about these shared relationships between European chamber music. Okay, so in American slave societies, of course, those same traditions, the ones with the horns and the drums that signal, military prowess and, courtly praise, become the subject of intense scrutiny and fear because suddenly on plantations, drums and horns signal threat of revolt. And there are, of course, a lot of laws passed around this across various colonies. So the meanings of sounds can change dramatically across space and time and for different listeners. European misperceptions and criticisms of African music eventually harden into sonic racism and stereotypes. For instance, many people came to believe that African people were naturally gifted in music. And by the end of the 18th century, references to Black musicality are all over the place. And if we look back to Richard Jobson's earlier descriptions and think about the sound qualities and musical practices that he and other travelers documented, I think it can help illuminate the origins of this stereotype and the sort of encounters that it grew out of. So Jobson wrote that there is without a doubt no people on the earth more naturally affected to the sound of music than these people, meaning Africans. Importantly, the substance of his comment, that the people he observed are naturally affected by the sound of music, differs from the idea that Africans have a particularly natural ability to make music, the stereotype that would come and that we're more familiar with today. I think this is an important distinction because musical ability became linked to Blackness and in racial fictions of biological difference that we got with the rise of scientific racism at the end of 18th century and throughout the 19th. And all of this helped to establish what Jennifer Stover, in writing about a sound and race in the United States, calls the sonic color line, or the process of racializing sound. Jobson's observation may have been a poor attempt to document the experiential characteristics and the vibrational musical aesthetics that he witnessed in Gambian performances. And that is, like most stereotypes, this one was created by outsiders who witnessed something of significance, but failed to understand it, and as a result, twisted the truth forevermore into great and damaging consequence. Black musicality is now a racial stereotype of global proportions. Behind the history of the trope, Liza's story about the vast circulation of African music and musical ideas in the age of European exploration and hemispheric trade along the European and African coasts. Traditions of African sonic knowledge traveled far and wide, ultimately transforming global music. And these performances could be said to have conquered a cultural terrain as vast as any empire. And yet the consequences of Europeans' misperceptions and judgments live on as well. Thank you.
So I want to first of all say that I hope people will notice, let me share my screen while I get on this right away, that my title is not the title. The title of my talk is not the title that's on the, can we do this? Come on, bring it up. No, it's not the title that's in the program. That title was a paper I published in 2016. I think I sent it in as a marker or something, or a placeholder. Anyway, this is what I'm going to be talking about today, not Palo Monte, but voodoo. So what I want to take as my starting point is the well-known fact that in many Afro-American religions, there's a pairing between a Catholic saint and an African deity. And this pairing has been interpreted in a wide variety of different ways. Most prominently as the idea that traditional religions were hiding behind the saints. That was a term that was used in the literature back in the 50s, so that they could still worship their African religion without incurring the wrath of clergy who were supposed to be looking out after them. And so I think that probably this particular idea is increasingly being challenged, and I want to carry that a little bit farther. So one of the things that was of interest to us was the source of the saints. Most people were interested in the source of the gods, and these particular group of deities were typically from the Yoruba Fawn region. We didn't find deities from elsewhere in Africa very much, or even at all, but Yoruba Fawn deities were the ones that show up in these categories. And so this was one of the big topics. But in a famous conference organized by Linda Haywood at Howard University back in the late 90s, Terry Ray and Hein van Hey both presented articles in which they proposed that the Catholics from the Kingdom of Congo played a significant role in the diffusion of Christianity in the Americas. And while they didn't address this question directly, I did try to address it in a paper I published in 2016, the one that bears the title, which you see on the program. And so I basically made the case that when you looked at, and this was true in much of the Americas, that the clergy was actually not particularly interested in proselytization. They weren't particularly interested in suppressing alleged African religious practices, and that in fact, if there was proselytization, it was likely to be from the Congos. I specifically noted that, and I brought attention to this, that there is a certain amount of evidence that indeed Congolese slaves did proselytize in the Americas. Probably the best quotation for that comes from Georg Christian Andreas Oldendorf's account of slavery in the Virgin Islands, where he describes in considerable detail how the Congolese would meet people as they came off the ships. They would give them a baptism, which composed of salt and water, which is in Kikongo, the word for baptism was kudia mungwa, meaning to eat salt, and then slap them for the sins they committed in Guinea, and actually serve as a sort of a godfather or godmother for the people they baptized. He believed those people were actually priests in the Kingdom of Congo. And while I don't believe that was true, I do believe they were probably what we call mestres de escola, school teachers, who were the grounding basically of Congolese Christianity. The European missionaries that come in and often describe the place are not the people who are doing the teaching. And that's really quite clear if you read their writing. The teaching was the mestres de escola. These were school teachers. The institution was established in the early 16th century, and mestres de escola operated throughout the Kingdom of Congo right through until the 19th century, right through the period of the slave trade. Okay, so what I want to do now is to say, okay, let's establish for a moment that there's going to be some component of Christianity that comes from the Kingdom of Congo. Not from all Congolese, not from all people who speak Kikongo or one of its dialects, but from the group that came from the Kingdom of Congo, which was throughout the entire period a determinedly Catholic country, albeit a Catholicism that included a great deal of traditional religion as well. So one of the things I wanted to do was to say, let's take a look at the expanse of African religions and talk about what African deities are about or what they might be. And one of the things that I did for that paper that Dr. Haywood, Linda Haywood, organized was I proposed to look at a traditional sources of Congo religion that were not from the Kingdom of Congo and not necessarily available to become Christians. And that was the Kingdom of Luango in particular, which was a Kikongo speaking but non-Christian community. I also looked at the Mbundu speaking people, Kimbundu speaking people to the south, who were also spoke a related language, or closely related languages, but we have good examples of them not being very Christian. And then also take a look at ethnographic literature and some other things to try to get at it. And from that, I came with a sort of a perspective on what we might be able to have. So one of the things that I did then was I took that model, both looking at contemporary witnesses of religion in Africa starting from the 16th and 17th century and going through the 19th century. And I crossed that with what we have of ethnographic literature and tried to make sense out of what there was. So here's some of the results of that. And for those of you that read the paper, you can see this all documented with the usual Thornton level of footnoting. So first of all, there's a debate within contemporary African theology about the question of a high God. John Mbiti in particular is a good example of people who are arguing that African traditions had a high God. This does not seem to have been a major player. And now there's a lot of literature that's saying, well, maybe there really wasn't high God kind of a concept. What's the closest thing we might have to a God in the African religions is what some people call territorial spirits or territorial protectors or territorial deities or shrine gods. All of these are possibilities. Typically what these entities are is they are the sort of guardians and protectors of specific territories. They control the weather, they control disease environments, and for the people, if they're organized into a kingdom or something, they might control sort of warfare and that sort of thing. Their responsibility is largely communal to the group where they live. And they are accessible typically at some physical location, not always, but frequently, which I'm calling a shrine. We know, for example, that they can sometimes expand their category. This is the Nanom shrine in Ghana. It's one that we have a contemporary 18th century record for, and I think there's archaeology that shows some of these shrines go back to the 14th and 15th century, so they're very much in case. But this particular shrine expanded as the Fantes Federation expanded. And became the deity or the guardian for a larger territory. It's an example of what might have happened. Another good example of this is a little bit less of a complicated shrine. This is one from what would be today Liberia. As you can see, it is the home of an actual king. So in this particular case, the spirit or the soul of that protector king has become himself a territorial deity. The next category to talk about would be ancestors. That is to say, when people die, they pass from this world, the material world, to the other world, the spiritual world. And while there, they acquire a certain number of divine powers, which allow them to intervene in this world on behalf of their descendants. Typically, of course, they are also quite local, unless, of course, it happens to be a king or a high ruler, in which case that particular person's ancestral spirit may be like a territorial deity. They can be accessed best, in fact, frequently only at their graves. They have limited range, both in terms of who can consult with them and limited capacity with regards to how much power they have. And the final category of entities, spiritual entities that we have, are a little bit hard to name exactly what they are, but they would be extremely local types of spiritual entities of many different sorts and of many different types. Perhaps one of the most common things that we find for their use is what I'm calling here a spiritual receptacle. That is to say, a material object in which a local spirit might be enticed to live or forced to enter, and which can provide luck, protection from problems like disease and things like that, and also might offer, what do we call it? Be used in witchcraft. Okay, now, all of these traditions point to localism. They are all locally situated. There's an exception. One of these, of course, is in the Kingdom of Congo. Catholic saints were co-revealed. By co-revealed, I mean that a Catholic saint was identified as being similar to, or actually the same person as the spirit in question. And a lot of local spirits shrines simply became churches, and their entities became protectors. So that provided us with one possible connection. The other, however, is the Yoruba Fawn. Of all the African traditions, the Yoruba Fawn are ones who had deities that actually had larger range, much longer range than other places in Africa. They were able to move from one place to another. For example, the famous snake deity, which is reported for us first in Ouida, actually originated, according to informants at the time, 17th century, in Alada, and came there. And subsequently, it was taken up by Dahomey when they conquered Ouida, and it became an important deity in Dahomey as well. Likewise, late in the history of Dahomey, it began to absorb deities from other areas nearby. That would include Yoruba deities like Ogun and Eleba. Okay, so this is our atmosphere in Africa. Now, what happens to people coming to the Americas from Africa? For most of them, virtually all their spiritual resources are back in Africa. Their ancestors are there in their graves. The local shrines cannot reach them where they are. And consequently, they have to do something, and they recognize, as they probably did, this is a speculation on my part, that there was such a thing as those type of entities were also to be found in the Americas. There's humans here, there's a similar terrain, they're probably local spirits. Where are they? What are they about? There are some people who come with them. We think about 1% or so. Jean Mogin, a priest in Martinique, actually identified 26 sorcerers out of 2,400 of his parishioners. And those sorcerers were presumably people who had the capacity to locate and to operate with spiritual entities. So those people immediately go looking about for what can be found. The other thing they're obviously going to say is, okay, are there territorial deities here? Well, everywhere they go, there are Christian churches. And it's pretty obvious from the behavior of, if nobody else, the behavior of the whites, that this is exactly where the territorial deities to be found. In Protestant countries, they were often barred from even being baptized or going to those churches, in which case we don't find any kind of fusion of deity and saint. No Catholic saints and no deities that would be represented by those churches. Consequently, they go to a focused religious that really just deals with these local spirits that can be captured in material objects. And that's where we get Kanjo or Obia, which don't have these sort of territorial spirits, but do have a lot of that local tradition. For the Catholic countries, though, they were welcomed into the rite of baptism, which gave them the access to the church, and then that church became their basis. Now, I'm now going to turn to, this is our snake deity from Ouida, and here we're at Saint-Domingue. So in Saint-Domingue, we know that, for example, very soon after the arrival of the takeover of the western part of Hispaniola by the French, that the Jesuits came in and began their religion. And from the very beginning, we see François Xavier de Charlevoix, his account, he was one of the first there. And he notes that basically there's Muslims from Senegambia, there's Christians from Congo, he recognizes that. And also there's the snake deity of the Alada. All the rest of them, he says, just have, like savagery and nothing except for what he might have identified easily as witchcraft. And so we know that this is more or less exactly what is going to happen in Haiti. So right away, the Jesuits do some missionary work, but basically, as elsewhere, a combination of a resistance on the part of French authorities to allow proselytization to go very far, the absence of much clergy and the interest of the clergy more in dealing with the patronage side of their thing than with slaves, and security legislation that made it difficult for people to assemble. Nevertheless, there was a lot of proselytization going on the ground. There are arrêtés published by the French government prohibiting people from proselytizing each other and indicating that that's what they were doing. They were holding classes and so on. I suspect, without being able to say for sure, that those people were Congos. And so what we see going on is there's a gradual evolution of two types of religious traditions. One of them is ostensibly and officially Catholic, has saints, and was probably introduced by the Congos this way. The other one was associated with the snake deity in particular, whose name is Daboy. We get this from American sources first. And we get the famous account of Emeril de Saint-Marie of the voodoo cult, or the voodoo dance, as he called it in that, in which we have this elaborate thing associated with this particular portable deity who has come to the New World. Interestingly enough, because of the French abolition and because of basically of practicing African religion. And the Haitian government post-independence, practicing anything other than Catholicism as it was officially recognized was illegal. So we don't get much of a description of what would be the emerging category of voodoo. Although there's lots of discussion about it, very little that describes it. But one of the places where I see the juncture between a Catholic saint and probably a deity from Fon-speaking area is in a report of an appearance of the Virgin Mary in a silk cotton tree. Now, Loco is one of the most important deities in the Fon pantheon, and that particular deity is known in a silk cotton tree. So I suspect that's what I call a co-revelation. That is to say, you see a Catholic saint along with the symbolica or the simulacra of an African deity. And that's reported in 1812, but again, I suspect it goes back a lot farther than that. It isn't until, ironically, in the 1860s that we actually get descriptions of this. One of them is by a Protestant French priest named Eldon, who reports finding in the home altars of people images of saints as well as what he would describe as voodoo things, which were typically the kind of thing that goes into making one of these spiritual receptacles. And Spencer St. John, this man who's famous for his lengthy denunciation of all of Haiti on the basis of sort of witchcraft manifestations of voodoo, nevertheless, in 1873, did take a little tour and looked at all the different ungas that he saw, the temples, and he noted that in these temples, they had images of saints as well as all the paraphernalia that went with voodoo deities. And it wasn't until quite a bit later that we actually, this is an example of such a shrine. As you can see, there's lots of saint pictures, and some of these things would be used in the process of capturing various local entities. It's only when you get the work of somebody like Jean Plimer, now in the 19th century, 20th century, Melville Herskovitz and Zora Neale Hurston, that we find this specific description of, in fact, the junction of these deities taking place. So I have done more than I should, and I'm going to stop now. Thank you very much.
I have lots of questions about sources and how we get to sort of how people experience things in the past through sources that don't necessarily tell us those kinds of things. But before we get to what I want to talk about, do any of you have questions for each other about your talks or things that came out that you thought were common themes? Sarah, do you want to jump right in?
Well, I just was amazed by the visuals that you used. I have a different question for Tim just about this red water stuff, because I was thinking about sound and the visual and touching the abdomen. And anyway, so I'd love to follow up on that. But just about the visual. So Mary, you have like this amazing image. I think it was from 1692 with the Congolese. I mean, if you can talk more about how the visual actually helps you as you're trying to recreate these soundscapes. I know in some of the work I've done, like the visual was incredibly important for trying to imagine how people dressed and how they were dancing and the ways they were playing the drums and the particular buzz of a feather across, pulled across the drum head, for example. So if you wanted to maybe even show that image again, it went by so quickly, I would love to see it. And John, the same kind of thing with the images, that one that you showed of Rita of the snake god. And then when you get back to some of the, some of the altars that are showing up in Haiti, I'm really interested in, if there were particular saints. So like if I know that Saint Anthony was very important in the Kingdom of Congo, for example, like, are there particular visuals or carvings that you see occurring that help you make these links across the Atlantic, so to speak? If you could talk more about the visual elements of that would be really super interesting for me.
Which one of us should answer first? Mary, you could maybe answer. Okay,
I'll share my screen again, if that's all right, to show the some of the images you were talking about. I'm glad I sort of left them as sort of like a tantalizing. I didn't have much time to talk about them in the presentation, so thanks for picking up on that. And I think you asked, is this the image you were interested in, the 1692 image from
I know the Stedman pretty well, but I've never
Yeah.
seen this, the 1692 one.
So I just as a side note, I'm actually in the process of putting together a digital exhibit of illustrations of African instruments from the early modern era that I'm collaborating with the James Ford Bell Library at the University of Minnesota. They have an amazing collection of, I think the focus of that library is global trade in the early modern era. So if you want a travel narrative, they've got it. And they also have actually all of Stedman's manuscripts. Anyway, so when I was there looking at their collection, I was just sort of shocked by how many illustrations I found. And this one, Marola, who was a missionary, actually there's an English edition was translated not long after, but does not reproduce the illustration. So it's interesting tracking where the illustrations get reproduced and where they don't. So for instance, the English translation of Duarte Lopez's narrative, which comes just 6 years later, actually does reproduce this image, but it's like a really crummy version of it. So it's really fascinating because it's kind of spot for spot. And this image really interests me because it's so kind of metaphorical, you know, in a lot of ways, like the kind of Greco-Roman attire and the way kingship is being represented. But also there's a lengthy description in the narrative about how in military practices, captains of the armies would use specific sounds to direct their troops. And it's really interesting. And so it's the illustration here, you know, of course, was made by someone probably who had no idea what they were illustrating, but it is a pretty straightforward representation of what's in the text, but sort of visually imagined according to this kind of Greco-Roman vernacular. So it's pretty interesting. One reason I really like the Marola image is because you know, as you get, and one of the reasons I rely on a lot of these 17th century sources is because by the 18th century, representations become so much more thickly laden with prejudice and racial stereotypes, and kind of the iconography is more exoticizing. And in this image, you know, as a musician, I find it really interesting because the musicians are, you can see how the instruments were played. You know, they're kind of actually, it's a useful image in some ways. And it's not particularly exoticizing, it's more trying to explain the instruments. And so I find that quite interesting. And I hope that, you know, by putting together this digital exhibit, it'll make some of these sources more accessible to specialists in African music. You know, who might not have access to these images, but know a lot more about these, you know, historic traditions than I might. And, you know, I'll be so interested in what people think of them. So I'll stop there. There's a whole lot more to say, but thank you, Sarah, for the question.
Just piggybacking on that, Natalie has a question as well, which she said that I should read, so I'll just read it really quickly, but which is, do you have information on the settings in which Europeans observed these musical performances and what groups of people were present? And I think that the sort of, the visuals might give some clue in that, but if you want to expand on that at all.
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, there are so many different kinds of descriptions. I would say the vast majority in travel narratives have to do with these kinds of diplomatic, sorry, my son is, I'm busy. Sorry, this is COVID life. So he's asking if he can watch TV. Yes, you can. Okay, so hopefully you, at least it's not the dog barking. Apologies. A lot of these are kind of, you know, courtly performances of stakes. So like, you know, you get off the ship and you're meeting the elite figure and, you know, who's got their processions, but then also, so you get those kinds of settings that are clearly kind of diplomatic exchanges, but also other kinds of festivals. And Jobson has a description of like a multi-day festival that was in round of ritual circumcision in the Gambia that's very interesting. So I would say there's such a wide range. Cécile Fremont has pointed me to some really interesting sources that are, manuscript sources of Catholic missionaries who are documenting some of these kinds of services that are in Congo Christianity, where there's people playing indigenous African instruments and European instruments in the context of liturgy. So there's such a wide range. But piecing them all together and having enough in one place at one time is tricky, which is why, some of this research I feel is a bit scattershot, which is something y'all talked about yesterday in terms of having to go with all these different languages and archives and places. And I often feel like my head is spinning. So it's great to be here with experts who can help fill in some of the gaps.
It's always worth remembering that Europeans were bringing their music to Africa as well as Africans bringing their music out. And in a place like Congo in particular, where we actually had people, doing cantatas and so on, and having an organ in the cathedral church in Banzo Congo. And the Jesuits claiming that certain songs would keep animals away from them at night. And then in Portuguese Angola, you've got a big exchange of guitar playing styles and so on. So there's a tremendous amount of creolization that takes place actually in Africa as well. And I found a tantalizing reference from a 19th century French missionary in Soyo, in the Atlantic province of the Kingdom of Congo, saying that people were performing music which was essentially Catholic church music, but it was not performed in exactly the same way, and that it didn't sound to his ears like anything in Europe or in Africa he'd ever heard before. And I thought that was really interesting. Also, if you look at the instruments where you see there's a great set of pictures of a Capuchin priest being received in a village, and people are playing hymns on marimbas and side blowing horns, and you're saying, okay, you're not going to be able to reproduce the same texture of a piece of music. You might have the same words, you might have the same notes going up and down, but there's going to be a whole lot more going on in that process. And those people are carrying that with them when they go outside. That's the thing. The unfortunate thing of the Kingdom of Congo was its long-lasting and devastating civil wars that dominated the 18th century, exported thousands and thousands of people. And that's really what brought so much of this sort of hybrid, creolized culture to the Americas from that one source.
If I could just say one more thing about that, because John, your work has really influenced me in this regard, and I'll just say that as an Americanist, that was something that I found really shocking, how much a cultural and musical exchange is happening on African coasts. We get this kind of image of Africa and Europe meeting in the context of the slave trade, and it's just so not true. And there's so much musical exchange going on, and that was a real tipping point for me to recognize that. And also African musicians in Europe, in German courts, and I'll find the citation and put it in. There's a recent piece on Black trumpeters in early modern Europe influencing music in that direction, not to mention Portugal and Spain. So
I think part of why I asked this, to really also piggyback on what Bronwen was saying earlier, is that, when you're trying to find other sources to elucidate experience and how things might have sounded, for me, there's like a very strong connection between sound and the visual. And so in earlier work, like those things, they allowed me to talk, like doing really close kind of minutiae level, studies of instrumentation and what have you, based on what I was seeing in portraiture, what have you, like allowed me to talk about sound in a different way. So I think that there really is a strong link. And I think that sort of led me into the more experimental stuff, in the next project, because, the guy that I'm writing a book on, everyone knows Moho. I mean, like he's the one who writes some of these early descriptions of Vudun, for example, right? But he was also a printer, and a lot of the ways that he told stories was really about how you present the stories. He was really thinking about type, and he was thinking about images, and and what have you. And so much of what we think we know about Saint-Domingue is based on like some of these early images, you know, for example, these, you know, these types, the seductive mulâtresse, or, you know, a Congolese enslaved person, for example. And so, you know, I think that, you know, the visual really is kind of this vehicle into talking about the other senses to get a, you know, like a more tactical sense, or not, well, tactical too, but like tactile sense of what people might have been thinking or feeling, and to try to tell those stories in different ways.
So that's it for today. Thank you all so much to this second panel of presenters. I'm going to refer to the top again. Just the presenters will be meeting again tomorrow at 5 p.m. UK time, which hopefully your Zoom will tell you whatever the right one is. And then everybody, we will meet again next Thursday and Friday, starting at the same time. Please, again, remember to register on the Eventbrite link for each of those days as well, because it's a different link every day. And thanks again to Judith for being here the whole time and admitting people throughout. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow or next Thursday and Friday. And thanks again, everybody.